Greetings, welcome to the episode of the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Aston Gregory. I am delighted to be joined tonight by Dr. Michael Yeadon. Now, Dr. Michael Yeadon has probably been one of the most in-demand guests or most requested guests here on the Pandemic Podcast. And I'm delighted to finally bring Mike to the show today. Now, for those of you who don't know Dr. Michael Yeadon, he's had that's his 33rd year, a 33-year career in leadership and of R&D and big pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry, having joined Pfizer in 1995, where he spent over 16 years of his career, eventually becoming VP of Allergy, or CSO and VP of Allergy and Respiratory Research, where he was responsible for the growth and the portfolio delivery of the allergy and respiratory pipeline within the company. He then later co-founded Xiaco, an independent clinical stage biotechnology company, progressing novel and differentiated therapies for inflammatory and allergic diseases before later being acquired by Novartis. Dr. Yeadon has published over 40 original articles and now consults and partners with a number of biotech companies. It's my absolute pleasure to have Mike here today. He is one of the few people from the scientific industry that's had such a prolific career in the way that he has, to actually come out and say some alternative views on the pandemic. So, Dr. Mike Yeadon, welcome to the Pandemic Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan. Looking forward to our conversation.
So first of all, we titled this episode, Can Lockdowns Ever Work? And I know you've spoken openly about your views on the lockdown. I would like to start here, though. I don't know, there's a simple explanation that you would like to share with the audience today. Tell us your views a little bit in a nutshell around why lockdowns don't work or whether they could ever work.
Yeah, sure. I'll happily do that. And just, yes, I'm probably infamous for saying something like pretty much everything your government and their advisors have said about the pandemic is untrue. And as a result, where we're about to end is not a good place. So, yeah, just on lockdowns, I have to say I'm embarrassed. It took me probably 10 or 11 months to work out why it didn't work. You probably will remember that around last summer, there started to appear publications that compared the outcomes of communities, regions, or even whole countries that had locked down with areas, not that there were many, that had not locked down. And surprisingly to many, there weren't much difference. There wasn't much in the way of difference. That's really because lockdown involved closures of businesses, working from home, but people were still allowed to go out shopping, and they asked to do no more than perhaps exercise once a day. So it restricted the number of human-to-human contact. And it just struck me that was unlikely to prevent the spread of a respiratory virus, but I hadn't really put my finger on why that was. So during the summer, the autumn, right up to now, I think there are now over 30 papers that show that when you compare lockdown and non-lockdown areas, there really isn't any difference in total mortality. And I kind of suddenly worked it out. And it's as simple as this, that lots of people, and I remember hearing Christopher Snowdon arguing, I think it was with Toby Young, and he was saying, well, what is wrong with you anti-lockdown people? It's obvious, is it not? This is a virus that's transmitted from human-to-human contact. So if you reduce the number of human-to-human contacts, he said, it must reduce spreading. And I kind of thought, it's not right. And then it came to me in a heartbeat. It combines two of the lies the government's told you. Asymptomatic transmission, that you can spread this virus without having any symptoms to another person. That's not true, by the way. It's been examined, it's not true. And so the number of person-to-person contacts isn't relevant. It's the number of infectious contacts. What you need is a person who's able to spread the virus, and I will tell you that it's someone with lots of virus and symptoms. And those symptoms are required to push the virus out of you, and you need to be adjacent to it, a susceptible person. And the thing is, if you've got a lung full of virus and you're symptomatic, you're going to be feeling ill. And if you're a really good source of infection, you're probably very ill. Well, you won't be wandering around the community. You'll probably be at home, maybe in bed. And if you're very sick, you'll be in hospital. So I think it was always unlikely that you would meet a really powerful infectious source in the community. And as a consequence, pushing everyone out of general community interaction made bugger all difference to transmission. And we knew quite early on that where we were seeing transmission was what's called nosocomial, really institutional. The question is, where are the people who are infectious, that is symptomatic, full of virus and susceptible people? The answer is hospitals, care homes, and mostly the domestic setting. Everywhere else, you wouldn't find someone who's full of virus and symptomatic. And here's the other thing. Not only would you not bump into a person, humans have had a multi-millennial radar. We've realized since we lived in caves that if you bumped into someone and they gave you an illness, you could die. Life was hard and you didn't want to be out of action for a week or two. So we're good. We scan people as we come up to them. We just notice unconsciously. Do they look like they're a respiratory virus threat, a respiratory illness threat to us? If they are, you can't help it. You just kind of walk around them. So I think very, very few transmission cases occurred in the community, and as a result, lockdown, which only affects the community and not nosocomial infections, I think that's why lockdown didn't do anything. It may not be right, but it perfectly fits two things. One, lockdowns did not help. Two, the lie about asymptomatic transmission.
Okay, so I think this is really a point of interesting conversation, and there's a few pieces I'd like to lean into here. So first, this is what I describe as common sense corner. Let's look at a simple equation: healthy person plus healthy person does not equal infected person. I've said that a number of times, and I'm known for talking about common sense corner over here, which you would have thought makes sense to most people. However, we've almost been led to believe that every person is infected. In fact, there's a billboard not far from my house that says "Act as though you have the virus." Now, clearly, this is based upon the idea of either asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission. Now, just prior to Christmas 2020, I read 18 different scientific papers in a row. I spent an entire morning. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. Well, I am a researcher. I research the heck out of everything I want to learn about, but I'm not a scientific researcher. But I spent a good part of a Saturday morning reading 18 papers back to back, which essentially talked about the asymptomatic transmission is exceptionally it's negligible to zero in some of the papers. But still, we're acting. I'm sure there's other papers that may say different to that, but 18 in a row said the same thing.
No, there aren't actually. There aren't any papers. That you are right. That obviously it is possible. If you imagine a situation, everything. There is a range of things in biology, from sort of low to modal to like a tail effect. And yes, I'm certain there have been people who were not aware they had the virus that managed to infect somebody else. But most of the time, in order to be a really good source of infection, you would expect the person to be, as it were, at the right-hand side, the high end of viral load. And it's not possible to have lots of virus and for that virus to be attacking the respiratory system and maybe systemic system, and for you to be fighting back and not to have symptoms. It might be a very brief window, pre-symptomatically, but at that point, the viral load is not very high. So yeah, the idea that asymptomatic transmission was an important driver of epidemic spreading. You may remember, I think, was it Dr. Kirkhoove, WHO, kind of let the cat out of the bag. They said we just hadn't found any. We didn't find any cases of or asymptomatic transmission was exceedingly rare. They tried to make her go and walk back that statement, but she didn't. She came back on the next day and said, our models say that asymptomatic transmission is an important driver. In reality, as you say, common sense corner, I hadn't thought of it that way. It's a really good description. But I just think it's a rarity. I don't know, a couple of orders of magnitude less likely than with people who are strongly symptomatic. It's the way it's always been. Has someone got a justification for why this respiratory virus would behave differently from others? Because we have not, to my knowledge, treated other respiratory viruses as like a really serious respiratory health threat to you, even when they're not symptomatic. No. So someone just cooked this up and told quite a lot of lies about a small number of events, and that seemed to be enough, coupled with ruthless censorship and personal attacks on anyone who said anything different. That's what we've seen for the last year.
Well, and you've actually been subjugated to that yourself, and you've taken a lot of flack, and I'm really pleased that we can still be here, because I know, the human tolerance. I've had to say myself, sticks and stones may break my bones.
Yeah, I got long past the point where I cared.
Yeah,
I did at first. It's not pleasant. I mean,
No.
I'm not enjoying this. I'm quite an introverted person, so I'm doing this because I got to tell people that almost every important thing your government has told you is a lie, that there has been a campaign of censorship and attack on anyone who brings an alternative point of view. And a lot of the people, including me, who bring an alternative point of view, there's no upside for me in doing this at all. So people might think, well, I'm a liar, or am I being paid by somebody? No, all I'm taking is hits and loss of reputation, being booted off several scientific advisory boards. I'm doing it because I look to my left and right, and most of my professional colleagues, many of whom I've discussed this with and who agree with me, won't say anything. And when I ask them why, they say, university policy is we just don't contest the government's views or that of their advisors, or we won't get grants from important bodies like Medical Research Council or Wellcome Trust. That's it. And so, because I'm not a member of any society, I wouldn't be a member of any club that would have me, then I'm able just to speak out, and I'll keep doing it until they either take me away, or people start thinking, well, maybe he's not wrong.
Yeah, you can see the kind of social and psychological dynamics playing out here. All it takes is to have one individual smeared in the public eye, and then all of a sudden, people's own self-conscious behavior comes out with it. They become concerned, and I've spoken to many of the doctors that have come on here. They're afraid of what impact it will have on their livelihoods, their future. You've mentioned that you've been removed from a number of different boards because of your views, which is crazy. I mean, this is open. This is surely open science should permit open scientific debate around these issues.
I know. Just on that point, though, I've been in that position as a CEO of a startup company. What you're focusing on your assets and the story and execution. And you do not want someone controversial associated with your company.
No, I understand.
They would say, we're quite interested, Dr. X, in investing in your company or talking to you about your molecule. This guy, that's the trouble. You do not want your advisors to be the story. And one by one, they said, Mike, and I said, I understand. Let's just send me the paperwork and we'll finish. And that's what happened. And I knew that would happen. It was not a problem. And it was done with good grace. But it is a problem that you do get removed. As soon as you become controversial, you're unhelpful to your clients. And that's probably a reason why people stop. Well, okay. You got to do the thing you got to do.
Yeah, but then we're faced with not dealing with scientific evidence. We're faced with dealing with an ideology around lockdowns. It's become an ideological battleground. To the extent that there's actually academic papers written about the moralization of lockdowns and how it's been associated with doing the greater good. Therefore, being complicit with the rules is a socially good thing to do. But none of the hard fact around that is that the general public alone, that they have to follow. If you start with the oversimplification of the science, as we began with here, which is if the virus transmits from person to person, which most people believe that it does, then if we cut social contact, then we stop the virus in its track. But as you and I know, that's a radical oversimplification of the issue. But that's something the public can get their head around in the main.
It's actually extremely clever. I have to credit the people who thought of this. I'm not saying they took years over the planning. I don't know that. It's not my crime, as I say to people. But the asymptomatic transmission is such a cool idea because people do know that it's human-to-human contact. Thing like masks. I mean, masks are just completely bonkers. What are you doing? But people, it's so close to the truth. It's so plausible. What else? Lockdowns as a consequence of asymptomatic transmission. PCR, it kind of looks like Star Trek, cutting edge. What could be wrong with that? Well, we could get into that if you like. And the same with variants. People understand that things mutate, they vary, but also their behavior. And that's kind of it. Almost everything they've said, it's very easy to explain at high level, so plausible. And once it's repeated 10 times, if I pop up and say what you've been told is not true because, as you say, radical oversimplification, at that point, it's just almost impossible to get anyone to believe you. But nevertheless, I'm here to tell you that lockdowns didn't work for the reasons I've described. Asymptomatic transmission is a tremendous rarity. We are not a respiratory virus threat to each other if we look well. PCR is a wonderful technique, but absolutely useless for industrial determination of infectiousness. It's no use for that at all. And variants are so close to each other, I call them samients. And so the idea that you should be worried about them and closing international borders and prepping up to make special vaccines against them, all of that's a lie as well. So you take us in any direction down that you think's right.
Well, let's talk about the variants. When I first heard about the Kent variant in a press conference, in fact, it was mentioned first in a debate that I was watching in the House of Commons by Matt Hancock, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go look at this. So I went and looked at it and came away feeling, okay, there's nothing I need to worry about here. But then 2 or 3 weeks later, there's a major press conference talking about the same thing, which they'd been tracking. This was in November. They'd been tracking it since September. So if it was a real problem, you've waited several months to actually announce it. But all of a sudden, we have this announcement around variants. But during that research, I identified firstly that at that point there was not many incidences of that variant, and I know that's changed over time. But I also learned that the actual virus itself had mutated significantly. Well, not significantly, but it mutated from its original form that came out of China, and the version that we'd seen in Europe, it was not a major shift, but a significant enough shift to be described as a new variant. But no one talked about a new variant in April last year.
Right.
So all of a sudden we have here this evolutionary process which all viruses go through, being used as what I describe as a lever for fear. But in terms of the science of it, tell us a little bit about how respiratory viruses evolve. What is their evolutionary path?
Yeah, I'll certainly do that. I know quite a few people. I've seen them and have said, I've looked. He's never published on coronaviruses. That means we can disregard everything he's got to say. I'll just point out to you that this year marks the 40th year of my love affair with human biology, biological sciences, pathological processes, pharmacology. So what I'm good at is I can read into a new area that's adjacent to what I know very well. And I've had to do that repeatedly in a leadership role, including when I left Pfizer in charge of allergy and respiratory medicines, and I ended up in skin. And actually, it's really quite similar if you think of the external facing surface of the body, again, allergic and inflammatory processes. I would say still that took me probably a year before I was able to go toe-to-toe with dermatologists and not look like an idiot. I had to work really hard. So I'm not a virologist, but it's not that difficult. What you do is you go and find the best literature written by the best people who write clearly. You read and read and read, and then you look at the references they've included, and you read those, and you keep going until you start coming across some of the stuff you started with. It's like a technique where you think, okay, I'm not an expert yet, but I've got a framework. I have not missed anything major. So with that, I would say certainly evolution of certain viruses, and I would say the influenza virus and this coronavirus are radically different, but the government, the liars who are supporting the government, have managed to steal a property of influenza viruses and implant that in the public mind as regards SARS-CoV-2, the virus that can cause COVID-19. So influenza viruses, they can often, when they replicate, they often swap pieces with a as it were, a sibling. I think it's called recombination. So you can end up with the top half of one strain of a virus with the bottom half of another one, and then you do it again and again and again. And so influenza viruses can, they're not so much antigenic drift as antigenic leaps. And after a year, it can present as essentially a new pathogen because it makes these leaps just because the way it can occasionally replicate. But that's not true of this coronavirus. It's got a very good error detection and error correction system. So when it borrows your cellular system, which is what it does, it borrows your cellular replicating machinery, orders it to make a copy of itself. If it's made a typographical error, typo in its 30,000 RNA bases, it sweeps it, detects it, and tries to correct it. So it doesn't make that many changes when it replicates, but it does make some typos that escape this sort of proofreader's eye. But they're really quite small. So it's a large number of tiny changes. That would probably be the fairest way of replicating it, representing it. A very large number of very tiny changes. And so if you look at, and this is worth doing, if you look at the sequence that was identified in Wuhan, and you look at the most different variant today, it's less than 0.3% difference. So there are 10,000 amino acids, the building block of a protein in the protein of SARS-CoV-2, and I think it's about 25 or 27 of them have been detected as changed in the most changed variant. That means it's 99.7% identical. Now, if you're not an immunologist, and I'm a pretty decent immunologist, and you might think you may not know whether or not that 0.3% is important. And the answer is it's not. And I've pointed out to people, the body surface area of a human, if you just take the palm, not the fingers and the thumb, just the palm, that's about 1% of my body surface area. So now take a third of that, about that little piece, smaller than the brim of my baseball cap or my sun specs. So it would be the equivalent of you knowing me well and then turning up with sun specs on and asking, is Dan Aston Gregory able to recognize this person as Mike Yeadon? Yes, my wife would say it's Mike with sunglasses on, even if they were new sunglasses. She wouldn't think it's a new person. Or if I turn my cap around, that's about a 0.3% change. Now, the human immune system's probably even more sophisticated than human vision. And so the maximum, what I'm telling you is the maximum change of any variant from the original is so small that it's not even implausible. It's impossible for it to present to the human body as a new pathogen. That's what immune escape means. When they talk about immune escape, it basically, you could be immune to the first virus, but this variant will be somehow so different that you kind of miss that and it invades you. That's the whole point. True, you don't need a top-up vaccine. It's not true. Let me just give you a real-world example. 17 or 18 years ago, there was an outbreak called SARS, the original SARS. And some enterprising immunologists early in 2020, recognizing that SARS-CoV was actually quite similar to the original SARS, they managed to track down people who'd been infected 17 years ago by SARS. And they volunteered and they drew some blood and they wanted to know the answer to two questions, which is, were those people immune to SARS that they'd been infected by 17 years ago? And did they recognize SARS-CoV-2? And wonderfully, every person who gave blood, they recruited, purified their T cells. Yes, when you applied bits of this SARS virus, they still responded 17 years later. It's not that much of a surprise. That's what T-memory, human T-cell immunity does. But what was rather wonderful is that if they exposed them to SARS-CoV-2, they also all responded. So, and those viruses are 20% different, 20. So roughly 80 times more different than any of the variants are, one from each other. So you just go and find that paper. It's quite easy. So it proves that human immunity is not fooled by a 20% change in the coronavirus. So you should not believe that a 0.3% change will allow the virus to escape your immunity. So this terrifies me because government ministers and sage experts keep coming on the radio and the TV every day warning you about variants. They're lying. They're either lying or advised wrongly. Why they're doing that, I don't know. It's not my crime. But someone is manufacturing so-called variant vaccines or top-up vaccines. And I'm even more frightened about that. Why are they doing that? There's no possibility that you are not immune to variants if you've been infected and survived or you've been vaccinated and survived. That was not meant to be a joke. You would have immunity. And so, unfortunately, you're being lied to about variants and not very important. But our border is pretty much sealed, and the grounds they're giving us for that is can't let these foreign mutants in. And I'm telling you that it's not very different. But the terrifying part is that pharmaceutical industry is reportedly making these top-up vaccines. I think Matt Hancock mentioned it this morning. Why are they doing that? And who the hell would want to be injected by what I believe is a superfluous gene sequence for an immunological event that's not occurred? And then the final thing that frightened the crap out of me about a month ago, I saw the world's medicines regulators, FDA, Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority in the UK, and the European Medicines Agency, I think Japan as well, they all said that since these variant vaccines, top-up vaccines, are so similar to the parent vaccines from which they are derived, we will not be asking the sponsors, the manufacturers, for any clinical safety studies. So I think I'm right in saying that if a pharmaceutical company on its screens designs a new genetic sequence for your vaccine, it'll go to manufacture, and as long as the manufacturing quality is adequate, the regulators won't ask any other questions. Imagine the future in which you've got your vaccine passport up on your screen, it pings you, Mike Yeadon, we're inviting you to come and have your top-up vaccine. Bring your child down, by the way, or we'll turn the top on your vaccine passport. You know, what the hell is going on? Now, again, it's not my time. I don't know why they're doing it, but I find that a terrifying trio of statements about variants that's not true, top-up vaccines are not true, and regulators that are just stepping out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, I call them scariants.
Scariants is good.
I have a couple of things on the variants in a minute, but just on the what I find interesting about what you said there about the top-up vaccines is that they're using the fact that they believe the virus is mutated enough to warrant the need for a top-up vaccine, but then it seems like a form of hypocrisy to then say that our vaccines won't need to change materially, therefore we can get through approval without further trials.
Well spotted. This is the sort of stuff that happens all the time. So I can believe one of those, that the virus mutates and that's why you need an update every year for influenza. And that's a really clever sort of segue one from another. But at the same time, how can we say that the virus has changed, the vaccines change so little we don't really need to test it, really, as long as you manufacture what you say you're manufacturing. And people don't pick that up. You have. Well done.
Well, yeah. Now, I suppose it, to clarify to people watching, Mike has come from big pharmaceuticals. He's worked for Pfizer, who are obviously one of the manufacturers in the vaccine developers here within the COVID vaccines. So how do we begin to distinguish? And I've talked about this in the context of financial services, in that we had I don't know if you remember, Mike, you're obviously from the UK. We had the PPI scandal where people had been missold personal payment insurance, where it was based upon the fact that everyone was given this form of insurance, but they never really established the underlying need, whether the actual person needed it. And it feels like a very relatable example for me, where we're looking to roll out vaccines on a mass scale, but we're not actually determining the underlying need of the, I won't say patient, because that implies that you're ill, but of the individual. I
have a serious problem with universal vaccination with exploratory vaccines is just unbelievably reckless, and I'm angry every day with not the general person that how do they know, but I would say any physician worth the salt knows you shouldn't be doing this. So people say, I think somebody wrote a nasty article which I haven't read, thank you, so I'm glad they wasted their time. Apparently I went from pharmaceutical whatever VP to anti-vax darling. I'm not anti-vax, I'm anti-unsafe medical procedures of any kind. I've worked my whole bloody life trying to work out what goes wrong in disease, how can we intervene in a way that might help without producing harm. That's really the nature of drug discovery, trying to find out what's gone wrong, how can you fix it, can you do that without unacceptable side effects. And what I'm seeing with these vaccines, they're quite interesting, they're completely novel. And I think when you don't know what's going to happen, the precautionary principle should apply. And so what you do is you find the people who are most at risk from the infectious disease against the thing that should provide immunity, and you stop there. Why would you want to start giving these vaccines to, say, I don't know, a perfectly fit 50-year-old with no prior underlying conditions? Almost no one of that description has acquired the virus and died last year. More, in fact, I checked, I'm a motorcyclist, more people fell off motorbikes and died last year than people of my description caught coronavirus and died. I was at the time 60, no prior conditions. And I looked and there were fewer people who had died in that description and fell off motorcycles and died last year. So why would you want to vaccinate tens of millions of people? The answer is you wouldn't. You wouldn't do it. And now they're vaccinating people my daughter's age, it's late 20s, mid 20s. That's just got to be the height of recklessness, right? You just, even in normal world, you just wouldn't do this. And yet I don't see anyone objecting. It's not anti-vax, it's just anti. We don't know enough to know that the risks of the procedure are the risks of the procedure need to be much lower than the risks of the untreated person. And you just can't find 25-year-old healthy women who caught the virus and died. It might be, again, to be fewer that fell down the stairs and died last year. Why would you want to vaccinate millions of people like that? And unfortunately, I think the obvious answer is to do with totalitarian control. Absolutely nothing to do with preventing an infectious disease. And if you can't see it now, if you're in the medical profession, you can't see that now. Shame on you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of play here. And I mean, I was watching the European Medicines Agency broadcast yesterday on the AstraZeneca clots, and whilst I do appreciate that in the scheme of things, these adverse reactions are still rare, they are occurring. They're occurring, but they're typically occurring in young women. And again, they repeatedly stated that the overall benefits outweigh the risks. Well, that might be true for the population that you've just described, that the elderly, vulnerable, comorbidities. Yeah. But they kept on stating that the risk of mortality of COVID is higher than the vaccine side effects. And again, that's you can't make that universal statement.
That's true. You can't. I do have a bit of history in this. So my first degree was in toxicology, and when you're working in research and development, the two things that worry you most is my medical hypothesis right? If I intervene in this way, if I get my spanner and stick it in the works, will I achieve benefit for the patient lives? And will I do this without unacceptable side effects? Those are the things a researcher worries about. The commercial people worry about, will there be enough patients? Can we charge enough? What's the competition? And so on. But I worry about, will I intervene and produce a benefit, and will I harm them, or will we be lucky? And the biological organism is really quite complicated. And I would say, as a general rule, if you intervene using your spanner, to stop some biological process that's harmful, to produce some benefit, you nearly always get some side effects. And what you want is a substantial difference between a dose that produces benefits and a dose that produces harms. And I think I noticed quite early on that I was noticing, at least in social media and other places, some side effects that looked like thromboembolic disorders. And I was in a group of medics, and we started looking at things, and we realized probably, I think certainly by January or so, we did have a worry that what was showing up, they did look like things that could be clot related. So I was just reading the literature around coronaviruses. This in the past, this is the 7th coronavirus I think that's been characterized, and I saw some stuff with SARS 2003, and I froze. And it was the spike protein is not some boring anchor protein like a little spike that you see on the cartoons. It's not inert. It's a fugogenic protein. It encourages cellular elements to stick to each other. And the way these vaccines work, some of it's going to be expressed by the lining cells on the inside of your blood vessels. Some of it. Unfortunately, the innovators, the manufacturers, were not required to characterize how that happened. And it occurred to me that the combination of knowing the biological properties of spike, at least of SARS-1 spike, which could be triggering cells to stick together, and also it can trigger coagulation. It's not very good at it, but I thought if it does it in some people who happen to have a higher concentration of the vaccine in a vulnerable spot in their body, and they happen to perhaps be closer to being able to be tilted into blood clots. I think that's what's happening. It's fine in most people, but I think there's a significant minority have got a vulnerability, and then they get what's called a tail effect. They'll be unlucky in terms of where the vaccine goes, how well it's taken up, how strongly it's expressed, and then finally their susceptibility to the adverse effects of spike. And remember, we know when people have got COVID-19, one of the properties is, or one of the consequences, sticky blood. People have often seen kind of strokes. So we shouldn't be that surprised. I think spike protein-based sort of gene-based vaccines I'm not really sure it was the smartest move. And I think that's the reason. And my default position would be, till you prove otherwise, that it's a class effect. I think all the vaccines that express spike or part of spike, I think there should be a cloud over it. And I'm not saying stop using vaccines, but I would say stop bloody using it in people who aren't at elevated risk of the disease. Stop that. That I just literally can't bear it, because there's no chance of benefit. If you're 25 and healthy, no prior conditions, you're not at risk from this virus. You're not going to die. You might get a little bit ill, not going to die. And so why would you risk giving several million young women of that description this thing for which we don't have adequate safety data? We've got about 2.5 months of formal data, and then there's the acute effects. Should just stop. That's where I am. That's where I am.
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they talked about it in the broadcast yesterday that it clearly demonstrates the challenges of a mass vaccination program, and that some side effects cannot be determined in the clinical trial. But we've seen that with every vaccine that's ever been developed. You can see things 2, 3, 4 years down the line, and again, that to me comes back to the point. And I could get called an anti-vaxxer for saying that, but actually, it comes back to my point around the financial services example. It's based upon need. What is the risk? What is the risk category of the individual, and does the risk outweigh the risk of the virus outweigh the risks of taking the product?
Just to make it absolutely clear, I'm a massive fan of vaccines. I think the well-established vaccines against diseases of childhood, that if we don't make a contribution ourselves to societal, as it were, herd immunity, there is then a risk of an outbreak. And I do see individuals choosing not to vaccinate their children, and that's fine as long as a small number of people make that decision. Some of the well-established vaccines, I personally don't have any concerns about them. And my children both had the full set. I did when I was young. No problem at all. I'm pro well-developed, appropriately dispensed medicines, whether they're crunchy white powders, tablets, creams, injections, vaccines, fine. I'm just not in favour of unsafe things, and I am sure by vaccinating everybody, including people who are not at risk from the virus, we can't help but do harm. And I think the younger you get, the more they net harm. And just a point about this, it's simply not true that only healthy 20 to 50-year-old women got these blood clots. I would say it was in that group that the background rate of that disorder was so low, the physicians could not look the other way. That's the reason. It was so low that when they got a cluster of 7 dead women, previously healthy, from cerebral vein sinus thrombosis, they thought, this is definitely strongly associated. I think it's causal, and I think EMA thinks it's causal. Don't you think that these lesions are also occurring in other people for whom that background rate's a little higher? Yeah, the answer is yeah, it is. It's just they've not picked it out from the background, because if you've got a background rate of blood clots, if it's a little higher, unless you're doing careful monitoring, you simply won't see it. So that's the reason they've spotted it. But don't be stupid, don't be dumb, public. If an agent has produced a thromboembolic event in a young, healthy person, you don't really think it's not occurring in an older person who's more likely to get it, do you? So I'm very troubled about that.
To be honest, I was actually watching the broadcast yesterday, and to be quite frank, I was just literally close to tears. I was just feeling what has the world come to, where we're in this position. There's 2 things I want to draw on from this. But one is herd immunity, and the second is medical ethics, I suppose. But herd immunity obviously is this holy grail that we're aiming towards. I saw an article that said on Monday, we'll We will be there, thanks to the vaccines and the natural community immunity. But my concern here, and here's my prediction of what's going to happen. Well, firstly, I'll ask the question in a minute, but around, are we driving a mass vaccination campaign in order to try and accelerate herd immunity and thus avoid natural transmission? Is that really the philosophy that underpins the decision? But before we discuss that, they asked the question following the recent Prime Minister's press conference around the difference between Israel and Chile, for instance, where both nations have gone through a mass vaccination campaign that delivered an enormous amount of vaccines. Yet Israel, in spring season, is seeing a decrease in cases and deaths, whereas Chile is now seeing a resurgence in cases and deaths, which to me points to serious risk at. We operate under the assumption that these things are going to work, but if they don't, then what's going to happen next year or this winter? We're back we've almost back to the point around community immunity. We've almost invalidated our own immune system and ability to generate natural immunity.
I must say I may be wrong, and I accept that I might be wrong. Okay, I'm definitely not perfect. I make lots of mistakes when you start connecting dots. And as I've said to people, probably the only unusual skill, outstanding skill I've ever had was I usually manage to spot patterns in sparse data. That is, before you've got enough evidence to be sure, I would often see a pattern, and I saw it earlier than my peers. I wasn't particularly any good at, outstanding at anything else. So pattern recognition. And so I thought, and I might still be right, that after the shape of the curves, certainly in the UK in the spring last year, made me think that it was unlikely we'd have a massive outbreak in the winter. And so when I saw the late autumn, area by area, little sort of Gompertz curves, I thought that's what I expected, about 20%, 30%. Then started vaccinating, and then there was just enormous peak of cases and deaths. So I am left not knowing whether I was wildly out or whether, in fact, those deaths are due to the vaccine. And I would say they're both viable possibilities. So I'm not going to claim I'm right now all vaccine deaths. I'm not going to claim I'm completely wrong. And all of that was just a second spreading. So I would say it's significant uncertainty there. I think by now, though, the evidence was pretty clear that there was a degree of primary immunity in the population. Everywhere that they looked, they did find a substantial percentage of people had immune memory because they'd encountered something that bears some similarity to SARS-CoV-2. So not everybody was susceptible. And then even FDA has calculated that something like, I think it's 25% they say of Americans have been infected. So obviously, if you add that to the prior immunity, and not a long way from herd immunity, and also the standard formula for herd immunity is wrong. It assumes that we're all perfectly mixed, sort of a homogeneous mixing model. Whereas if you look at people who deal with the mathematics of heterogeneous transmission, you don't need anything like the percentage immunity in the population before it stops spreading. So I'm pretty confident we could lift all the measures tomorrow and nothing bad would happen. You could even take your mask off and go to the pub. But unfortunately, the government's persuaded you that we have to live in a biosecurity state. Everyone needs to be vaccinated. You need a vaccine passport. You must ask me about vaccine passports, Dan, because I'll put a challenge out if you ask me.
Yes, okay, yeah. I will. So I think just to close up on the herd immunity, I suppose my personal fear here is, we're asking the question, do lockdowns ever work? My personal belief is that the human interventions into this pandemic, both through lockdowns, restrictions, not vaccinations themselves, but a mass vaccination campaign, I believe we've actually caused a bigger problem. I personally believe we've extended the duration of the pandemic by the approach we've taken, but we've also limited the community immunity effect from allowing young, healthy people to circulate freely.
I think that's true.
Which is a concern, and I think it comes back to the ideology around here around asymptomatic transmission, the fact that everyone is led to believe that the risk is equal across all populations, and I concur. It's beautiful where you are. It's a warm, sunny day. We know from previous viruses that the coronavirus is that there's a seasonal effect, and actually, in the warm summer months, typically we see much lower transmission. So I think I see that as a golden opportunity for liberty to be restored, and actually for gentle transmission of whatever remnants of the virus is left amongst.
Absolutely. If your government was looking after you, you'd have to ask, here we are now, in the second week of April, and I'm very lucky, it's cold, but it's sunny here. We're outside of the respiratory virus season. We're right on the down leg. If you go and look at the prevalence data using lateral flow in schools, even PCR testing, which has got an undisclosed false positive rate, right? Okay, that's one of the things. It's not an opinion. It does. And so I would say at the moment the prevalence of the virus in the community is so low that you shouldn't have any concerns. I bet there's still some in hospitals and other institutions, but of course the medical staff, having been patient-facing for a year, the chance they could have escaped exposure at some point is just remote, and they've had an opportunity to be vaccinated. So I just don't understand what it is that people think is hazardous in their community. But I just want to briefly talk about vaccine passports. I don't really know how they managed to fool everybody. Say, Dan, I'm a vulnerable person, and I've chosen to be vaccinated, and all is well. I'm now protected according to the clinical trials. Pretty good. I'm not interested in knowing your immune status. I've no interest in it at all. So here's a person who's been vaccinated, could be vulnerable. I don't care who else in the room has or hasn't been vaccinated. So I don't need to know. I don't need a vaccine passport. I don't want to show one. I don't need to see yours. You're a younger person, fit and healthy. Perhaps you've declined the vaccination so far. And you're not a threat to me because I'm protected. I'm not a threat to you anyway, because it doesn't matter who infects you, you're not going to die. You don't need to know anyone else's immune status either. No one in this benefits from knowing anyone else's immune status. The only person who benefits from knowing your immune status and using it to allow you to cross or not cross a threshold, or to do or not to do a transaction, are the people pushing it. Like people like Tony Blair, Matt Hancock, Bill Gates probably. You and me do not need to question each other's immune statuses in order to interact safely now any more than we did in the past. So, and you can have your country back tomorrow, folks. Just need to say no more of this bullshit. Thanks very much. Don't need any masks. No, I'm not coming for my vaccination. I'm not a vulnerable person. My friend's opening the pub. I'm going in for a pint. The thin blue line's too small to stop all of this. But if you lot want to decide that this is something unique, this virus is so unique that we need to kind of lose our liberty over it, well, then be my guest, you will. Because once the vaccine passport's up and running, it's going to be the world's first common format digital database. It'll have everybody on the planet gradually will be on it with a unique digital ID. It'll be interoperable everywhere in the world, whether it's Birmingham or Bogota. You'll be told, the rule will be told, it'll have at least one editable field, which initially will be your vaccination status, either valid or not. And then if an algorithm is set that says, in this city, only people with a valid vaccination passport may purchase a coffee, rent a hotel room, even enter the border, then forever after, you see, this tool will stop a non-vaccinated person arriving and allow a vaccinated person to arrive. So, but you don't need these things, but they're the perfect tool for totalitarian control. And just look at Israel. They've introduced them. They had a raw majority, I think just over 50%. They introduced Green Pass. And people who have not got vaccinated are not allowed to access their work, shops, synagogues, sports facilities. That's what will happen in this country if you let it go forward. You do not need it. The only purpose is totalitarian control. What they will do with that power, I don't know. I'm not a mind reader, but I have pointed out that the variants and top-up stuff, certainly could provide a means for harm if you were worried that that was on the cards, which I am. But so I ask any MPs, one more time, you do not need vaccination passports. Throw yourself in front of the bloody train. This is the only useful thing you've ever done in your life. Build an alliance across parties and do not pass this legislation. Don't be fooled by it being temporary. That's a lie. You don't need it ever. And if you allow it, it will destroy this liberal democracy, and there is no way back from the gates of hell.
No, I feel very strongly about the vaccine passport issue, and I know in the UK it's expanded beyond the vaccines to look at antibody status and COVID status, testing status. That is,
don't let them fool you with that. Let's say they let you briefly have antibody status and say a PCR negative. You go, well, that's okay then. A few months down the road, they go, we're not going to allow those alternates. It's vaccines or nothing.
But even
that's all they need to do. Just don't assume any goodwill on this. They've lied to you for a year. PCR, asymptomatic transmission, masks, lockdowns, and now bloody variants. Do not think anyone in authority or their advisors has got your best interest in heart, because they don't. They've not had your best interest. They've smashed the economy, destroyed society. They've used psychological operations against the people to torture, depress, and hurt everybody. So if they give you some bullshit about temporary vaccine passports to allow you to return to normal society, what is really needed to return to normal society is truth, honesty, because we're not under extraordinary attack by a virus. We are under extraordinary attack by people who have taken over our government, and this is your last chance. I'm going to do another 4 or 5 interviews, and then I'm going to vanish, because I believe vaccine passports are voted for in this country. There is nothing anyone can do about it, and I will stop. Okay, that's the end. I'm not doing this for fun, and I believe that's the turning point.
Yeah, I mean, at the simplest level, they are the greatest sales aid a pharmaceutical company could ever wish for. Yeah. And again, coming from pharmaceuticals, I know there's commercial pressures, but actually, this comes back to it goes beyond ethics. It's moral. I was talking to a friend who came to visit from South Africa, and he lived in South Africa at a time where people were divided by race. Here we are being divided by potentially divided by a medical apartheid, and the challenge with that is there is no logical base. It's just another illusion of safety device. It's not. Yeah. If you look at the vaccine level, absolutely, we don't know if it prevents transmission. It's just there's no rational basis for it.
Even if vaccines do reduce transmission, and as an honest biologist, I think they will. For Christ's sake, if the vaccine gives you immunity, and if immunity means that you more rapidly defeat an infectious pathogen arriving in your body, of course it's going to reduce viral load. That's bound to reduce transmission. It doesn't matter if you don't care whether someone is transmitting a little bit or a lot. So don't let them fool you with, we've now discovered they reduce transmission, so you must all have them. If you're vulnerable and you've been vaccinated, you do not need to worry about anyone else's immune status. And if you're not vulnerable, or you've chosen to take the chances, then you don't need, or it would be a bloody cheat to ask about other people's immune status. And also, anybody, even if you believe, let me just say to people who are skeptical about what I've said, let me just say to you, if you believe pretty much everything the government and SAGE has told you, there will be plenty. Please look at the power for harm, whatever the potential for harm that would come from this first in world, interoperable, unique database with a health-related flag that can be used to set permissions to do or not to do, or be or not to be across. You don't need this to do with viruses. Just look at the potential for harm. And so if you really want a vaccine passport, make sure it cannot do those things. Make sure it's got, it'd have to be printed like a bus ticket. Remember in the 1970s, like a little bus ticket. Just make it something that's effective, but so useless as a tool of control, it won't do that. Just don't introduce a kind of real-time, online, interoperable, globally available database, editable database, because that's the thing that will just take us down. If you really want vaccine passports, make sure they're printed out on rice paper like bus tickets in the 1970s. It will still give you everything you need, but it won't provide those harms I'm concerned about.
Yeah, it sets dangerous precedent.
It's a dangerous thing.
Well, Mike, you are known as being the kind of calm voice of reason, but I think we found your trigger point here.
I'm angry and I'm bloody desperate. I've reached the You are right. I'm close to tears a lot of the time because I've tried my best, to criticize technically some of the things that were being done wrongly with the PCR test and so on, and bloody masks. But and I didn't know where it was going. It's only recently I thought, oh my God, this is a tool for totalitarian control. Go and do some research on Israel. Anyone watching, it's not on mainstream media because whoever it is that's doing this has complete control of mainstream media. This is why Dan's here and why I'm here, not on the BBC. Why would anybody want to censor these scientific conferences? Because it's not what it seems. And when I realized that fact that it doesn't really need to do with vaccines, it's just anything that will persuade a gullible, steerable public to go along and have something, so you can set some health-related biometric flag in the up position or down position. Anything would have done, but this is just it's very cleverly and artfully done. And so if you look at Israel, and it's awful to see that it's Israel, and we'll be next. We are next with a lot. We are the most advanced first world country in terms of percentage of us vaccinated. I think, was it 62% or something? They could close the database tomorrow, just live.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of you would feel coerced within the next few. Oh God, I better get vaccinated. Be up to 75, 80% within a couple of weeks. No one's going to care about the unvaccinated at this point. You can just gradually tighten the algorithm. You can't first go across a border or into blue water or a big cinema, and eventually it's your local supermarket, local pub, leaving your house. And gradually you'll coerce the last few people to be vaccinated.
Well,
just don't let it happen. Don't let it happen.
I totally agree, Mike. I mean, in Israel, the health minister publicly stated that those who do not get vaccinated will be left behind. And that for me is such a tragic sentiment, because it's based on everything we've talked about here. This isn't based upon the need. I appreciate we've had a crisis and it's put a lot of people at risk, but we're not doing it a proportional need-based approach here. You're absolutely right. This is this becomes a tool of division. It becomes a tool of potential control. The only thing I would say, playing slight devil's advocate, is it does appear that the system is falling apart somewhat in Israel already.
Hopefully. Just one last thing before we close, as I know we're over time. Unless I'm wrong, I don't believe a single child in the UK who didn't have an underlying chronic condition has caught the coronavirus and died. Right? And I think there are about 10 million people 10 years and down. And you can see, because government's talked about it, they've said we will have completed our safety studies and proposed vaccinating children. I think it was August, something like that. You don't need to vaccinate any of them. So honestly, why would you want to vaccinate people who don't die from this disease? Because even there's like 1 in a million side effects and deaths, that would be 10 children you killed for no benefit. And it won't be 1 in a million, will it? It'll be worse than that.
Yeah, and we don't know the long-term consequences.
So that's sort of last evidence. And if you think, well, they won't make children do it, if the vaccine passport system is up and running and you are the parent of a child and it pings and it says, bring little Johnny down or little Jemima down for vaccination, you'll bring them, because underneath it'll have a little note that will say, or your vaccine passport will lapse. Just unbearable levels of coercion. And they're talking about, I think they had to pause it, but they were running a 200 or 300 patient study, safety study in children. 300 patients is not a safety study, it's propaganda. Because if there was an event that occurred at 0.1%, you'd miss it. If that effect was lethality, you'd miss it. It's not a safety study, it's propaganda. And you do not need, so you can see it. I've argued correctly, you don't need to vaccinate children, but they have an intention to do it. And they're running a study that's not a safety study because it's like 10 to 100 times too small. So it's up to you. If you want to follow this pathway, it's a road to hell. Stop it while you can.
Well, on that bombshell, thank you, Dr. Mike Yeadon, for your insight today. And thank you to everyone who's participated and shared throughout this. Thousands of comments. We had over 2,300 people watching live simultaneously through this video, which I believe is a pandemic podcast record. So thank you for those who shared this episode. Right. please do share this. And lastly, I'll ask that you please subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast, because as we enter in this phase where we're talking about these issues, we know that the tech companies are clamping down on any dissenting voices. This is no longer about, I was discussing with another broadcaster today, it's no longer about misinformation. It's about anyone that dissents from the mainstream narrative. This is no longer based upon the evidence. It's simply those who stand against the incumbent voice. So please make sure you subscribe. Go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, where you'll join our email newsletter, and we'll keep you up to date with wonderful interviews like the one today with Dr. Mike Yeadon. Once more time, Mike Yeadon, thank you so much for your time on the podcast today. It's been a real pleasure hosting you.
Thank you, everybody.
This afternoon.